Hi, I'm with Professor Mohammad Marandi from the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, who's in Tehran. It's Friday, May 8th, 2:17 p.m. out here in Los Angeles. It's very early in the morning on Saturday out where you are. Thank you for joining me, as always.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to get an update. I feel like every time we talk about Iran, we're back to exactly where we started. Trump says he wants a deal. He says a deal's on the table. But he also says that Iran faces complete destruction if it doesn't agree to said deal. Yesterday, he said something very remarkable. And he said that there'd be a glow over all of Tehran. That reporters would be able to know.
Glow.
An orange glow over all of Tehran. I read that as though nuclear strike. That's how I heard that. I'm sure some people in Iran heard the same thing that I heard. Where do we stand right now, Professor? I know that Iranians are considering the U.S.'s new proposal. Do you have any insight on where we are and if that's moving along?
I don't think Iranians are going to be intimidated by Trump. It does show how evil he is, and it shows how evil his supporters are. And it just shows how evil the political establishment is, which includes the media, because Western media, Western journalists, Western politicians across Europe, the European Parliament, parliaments in Canada and in the UK and Australia, New Zealand, no one condemns these constant threats of Holocaust. He's been threatening to carry out a Holocaust against the Iranian people for weeks now. But the Western political establishment is so morally bankrupt, and Western media and Western journalists are so, mainstream journalists, are so morally corrupt that there's no outrage, there are no protests. But I'm sure that the Iranian proposal will be one which completely dissatisfies the United States. The Iranians are not going to compromise on principles. They're willing to be flexible on technical issues and that sort of thing, but to give up its sovereignty or its rights or to relinquish its demands for compensation for the slaughter of so many women and children, that's simply not going to happen. Or for Iran to allow the slaughter in Lebanon and Gaza to continue, no, that's not going to happen. So whether Trump likes it or not, he's going to have to deal with an Iran that is steadfast in preserving its sovereignty, and it's steadfast in supporting its allies. But at the same time, it is prepared to move towards peace. But we see that already in the ceasefire, it is the United States and the Israeli regime that have been preventing a ceasefire agreement that was agreed upon from being implemented. In accordance with the ceasefire agreement, at the end of the 39 days of fighting in this war of aggression, it was agreed that there would be a ceasefire across the region, including in Lebanon. Then Netanyahu began to carpet bomb Lebanon and slaughter hundreds of people within minutes in order to wreck the ceasefire. And Trump sided with Netanyahu. And even the Pakistani mediators came out and said no, that Lebanon was included. So that held back the implementation of the agreement for 10 days. Then Trump imposed a siege on Iranian ports, and that's prevented it from being implemented till now. If the United States had implemented its side of the bargain, right now we would have had weeks of ships going from the Strait of Hormuz, from these 5 countries that were assisting the United States in its genocidal war against Iran. Remember, the Strait of Hormuz was never closed. It was only closed to those regimes, like meaning Kuwait, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE, that were assisting the United States in attacking Iran. But for countries that were not and are not hostile towards Iran, the strait has never been closed.
You mentioned the media, and I wanted to get your take on your most recent interview with Piers Morgan. And every time you're on his show, he describes you as the Iranian regime's chief propagandist, and that's you. And
Yeah.
I'm a journalist in the U.S., and I've been speaking to you for months now. And and I know why you're on all of these shows. It's because you give insight into Iran that just simply is not available in the U.S. mainstream. And I just wanted, just for 2 seconds, one of those instances was about 2 or 3 months ago. We were talking, and I asked you, well, what is Iran going to strike Israel very hard if the U.S. attacks? And you said, no, the vast majority of the Iranian missile supply and drone supply is actually pointed at the Gulf states. And I thought that was very interesting to hear. And evidently, Trump didn't watch our show because he said he was stunned that Iran would take it out, or at least target these Gulf states that house the U.S. military bases. So, Professor, how do you respond? We obviously saw your response to Piers Morgan. You reject his claim that you are a propagandist. What's your take on going on shows like that? And what would you say to people who watch this interview and say, well, look at Edmund Demarche putting up softballs for the professor? What would you say to those people?
Well, first, I should point out that Iran did strike the Israelis very hard, but obviously the firepower, the bulk of the firepower was the United States. So obviously the Iranians were going to focus on hitting back at the United States. When the United States is in the Persian Gulf, using all these countries and very close to Iran, the threat from U.S. Attacks is much greater than that of the Israeli regime. So it's proportionate. And I'm surprised that the American government was surprised, especially since I've been saying this for many years, well before Corona, that if the United States assaults Iran, then Iran will do what it did in the Persian Gulf. This is not new. With regards to being a propagandist, I think that it's quite clear that when I asked Piers Morgan a number of times what he thought about the legitimacy of an ethno-supremacist regime, he refused to answer the question on not this latest interview, but the one before. And that's because he is the one who cannot say, who cannot speak out. He cannot be open about his views. Because if he did say that ethno-supremacism is not legitimate, then he would be saying that the Israeli regime is not legitimate. And so his silence actually reveals quite a bit. In my case, I have no problem with insulting behavior or friendly behavior. For him to insult me I don't know if he takes pleasure in it, or those people who broadcast his show expect him to be insulting to me. I've seen him interview spokespeople or former spokespeople for the Israeli regime, people who are advocating and supporting genocide, and he's very friendly with them. It doesn't bother me. I mean, I do what I feel I have to do. Sometimes people tell me, including family members, not to go on his show. But I always say that even if one person somewhere in the world listens and changes his or her mind, for me, that's enough. I don't care if I'm insulted or attacked. Uh, I during the most difficult times, when for example, there were riots in Iran and the entire Western media was uh, promoting a certain narrative, when I knew it was false, I spoke out, and it didn't matter to me if they called me a child killer or a murderer, because for me, saying the truth is what's important. And I think that time has shown that I'm not all that inaccurate in my assessment. These very same people who are constantly hostile have been saying that Iran is about to fall since I was a teenager. And well, it's still around. And they, during the 12-day war, they expected Iran to collapse. And I said, that's not going to happen. During this war, they expected the same. And they always said it was propaganda. In fact, Piers Morgan, once we discussed military conflict, and he said, you're full of hot air. Well, we saw how Iran performed, both in the 12-day war and, more importantly, in this war. So I think that my assessment of regional politics of Iran and of the empire, when it comes to our part of the world, is not all that inaccurate. And I have no fear of being insulted by these people, but I think I've always been honest in everything that I've said throughout the years. There have been times where I may have gotten something wrong, but if I have gotten something wrong, it was because it was not because I was hiding anything. It was just maybe I got a number wrong, or I predicted something wrong. But I always say what I believe. So I don't think your questions are softball, or hardball and softball.
Yeah.
That's for propaganda. What is important is you have a conversation uh, to figure out what's going on. And I have conversations with people to also figure out what's going on. When I speak with you, I listen to your questions and the things that you say, because I want to also understand what the thinking is in among people in the United States, or what sort of arguments are being put forward. Uh, why would that be? Why would one even divide uh, interviews between softball and hardball interviews? What is important is that we have a conversation, and that we assess the situation and try to give a more objective um, description, or provide a more objective understanding of the situation to lead to better results. I think I spoke with you before about um, Clinton Hillary Leverrett's book, Going to Tehran. When they wrote that book, they were attacked left and right by the think tankers, the policymakers, and they were marginalized and sidelined, even though they had worked in the White House. And they were accused of, simply because they wrote objectively about Iran, and they were accused of being, I don't know, propagandists. Or instead, they listened to Zionists, uh, the fanatical people who believe in ethno supremacism, even though they're not Semites, ironically, but for the most part, at least. But but if they had listened to these people instead of making ridiculous accusations, we wouldn't be in this catastrophic situation where the global economy is crashing. So they can call them softball, or they can demand hardball or softball questions. My answers would still be the same, but I think showing respect to whoever it is that one speaks to, unless it's some war criminal or something like that, I think it shows um, more about the speaker. It reveals more about the speaker than anything else.
I asked Scott Ritter today, the former UN's weapons inspector, whether or not he thinks Donald Trump wants a peace deal with Iran. And he said he thinks he absolutely does, because Trump wants out of this war, according to Scott Ritter, because of the economic decline in the U.S. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think that Trump is sincere when he says he wants a peace deal and to end the war?
Well, I wouldn't use the term sincere for Trump in anything, but I agree that he wants an end to the war. But I don't believe has the cap. He's a very weak person, and he is constantly flip flopping, and so I don't see him as being capable of bringing about any peace. I mean, he's a war. He's slaughtered many Iranians. He's helped with the genocide in Gaza. I mean, he's a utterly evil person, and his supporters are as evil as he is in many ways. But I mean, those who are knowledgeable about what's happening, they are definitely the same as him. But maybe many Americans who are just ignorant of politics and the reality, and their propaganda is, maybe many of these people are different. But um, I don't think he's capable of taking ending this war with a peace deal. My if there's any success, it's probably with some sort of ceasefire, where
An unstable ceasefire that stays for years? Like, do you think it's going to be something that drags out for years potentially?
yeah, something like that. Yeah, I think it'll be something like that. I mean, because I don't because the United States can't, unless there's a sea change in the United States, and that is not impossible, but I don't see it at the moment. I mean, we saw how Russia evolved after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It became an entirely different country. We saw how um, South Africa evolved radically after the fall of apartheid. the United States is changing very rapidly. Life is becoming much more difficult. It has been becoming much more difficult for decades. Young people and increasingly older people are becoming much more politically aware about Palestine and about politics. Uh, there could be change in the United States, but I don't see it happening overnight. So with this political regime, where the Democrats and the Republicans are all, they're all subordinate to an Epstein class, I don't have any hope for good relations between Iran and the United States because the United States supports ethno-supremacism and genocide, the political class, the media. Well, for example, look at before the media pretended that they couldn't say anything about Gaza because they weren't present. They said we don't have a presence there, so we can't, comment. That was their excuse to help the Israeli regime carry out the Holocaust. But now in Lebanon, you see that there are more Western journalists in Lebanon than in any other Arab country. Yet they do their best to conceal what the Israeli regime is doing, targeting civilians, carrying out atrocities, ethnic cleansing. They'll look away or they'll try to pretend that these are Hezbollah strongholds. And when I spoke to a couple of these journalists, and both of them said basically, no, I didn't write uh, uh, um, Hezbollah stronghold. My editor, both of them in the same sort of way said our editors or my editor, their editors put that in. Doesn't change anything. It's in their name, so they're complicit in the genocide and these genocidal attacks. So the West, I don't see the West being ever under these circumstances to come to terms with Iran because the gap between the two sides is too big. We oppose ethno-supremacism. We oppose the extermination of Palestinian children. They support the extermination of Palestinian children. To be very blunt, Western journalists, mainstream journalists, Western politicians support the extermination of Palestinian children. We are utterly opposed it. And we utterly condemn it. And therefore, the schism, the gap between us is infinite. Will that change in future? Well, either we have to become supporters of genocide, or people have to come to power in the United States that oppose genocide. And until then, I don't see any peace possible, but I can envisage a ceasefire where we have relative quiet for a while.
And tell me, China and Russia, they're still watching this war unfold. Do you see one country or the other having more interest in the relative success for Iran during this conflict? Do you think Russians or China? Who's more interested in the outcome in your view? Would it be the Russians or China or equal?
Both. But Russia is more open about it and probably more
assertive.
Yeah, something like that. Now, both of them are, I think, very surprised about the performance of Iran. And both countries and others are very surprised that Iran performed so well in the war. And you can tell from the statements made by President Putin and by statements made by Chinese officials during the trip of the foreign minister to these two countries. But yes, both of them do feel that that Iran's success is their success, because the United States is if Trump smells blood, then he'll go on to the next victim.
Might be Cuba, so that wouldn't have to worry them though. Tell me, my last question, Professor, and again, thank you as always for joining the Trends Journal. How does this war right now change the strategic relationship between countries in the Gulf? Because we see the UAE, they at least appear to be moving closer to Israel and the U.S., while other countries, it seemed to be a little bit more of a frayed relationship up until this point in the war. Do you see anything that people aren't noticing in these strategic relationships that has surprised you or was very predictable? And where do we go from here? Where does Iran stand? Like, is Iran a new polar? Is it more? Is it part of the multipolar world now in Tehran in its position on the world stage now?
I think Iran has always been that, but now Iran is more powerful. ironically, after the war. And if there's further war, which is expected by many in Tehran, I think that will still remain the case. Iran is becoming more important, more powerful because it has won this war. And of course, now that it is going to control the Strait of Hormuz permanently, that is going to change the balance. The countries in the Persian Gulf region, uh, I think it's too early to say much uh, about any change in their behavior because in the coming days, if the United States launches a war against Iran, they're going to need their airspace and their land and their sea, I mean, and their territorial waters. So we'll see what the Saudis do. We'll see what the Kuwaitis and the Qataris do. I am not entirely optimistic about them having the ability to assert their sovereignty in the face of their U.S. their American overlords. In the case of the Emirates, I think it's a very foolish and misguided policy, but this has been going on for years now. Ironically, during the 1980s and the 1990s, Iran's relationship with the Emirates was the best of all the countries in the Persian Gulf. But ever since Mohammed bin Zayed came to power and his tilt towards the Israeli regime and then his pursuit of all policies that benefit Israel, whether it's in the Sudan where he supported the genocide, whether it was in Yemen where he supported the genocide, or where in Somalia or in Libya, or all of his policies have been to the benefit of the Israeli regime, to a point where even Saudi Arabia has become increasingly angered by the regime. So, and one thing that I believe is true about all of these regimes, but perhaps the Emirates in particular, is that these very wealthy despots whose wealth stems from not any individual competence of their own, even though no billionaire deserves $1 billion. But anyway, they're not wealthy because of their own competence. It's because they're dictators that control countries, and those countries happen to be very wealthy for the most part because of natural resources. These people are surrounded by yes men, and they have everything that they would ever want, and they're not particularly smart. None of the leaders in the Persian Gulf, the Arab family dictators, none of them are very smart people, and they're not surrounded by smart people either. And so they're surrounded by yes men. Reminds me of Trump, and they also, they have everything that no one ever says no to them. So I think it's very difficult to make them understand the real world. They live in their alternative universe, and that I think makes them in some certain ways very similar to Donald Trump.
They live in the world of $400 million Boeing 747s as gifts, and that's their universe. New resort on a new.
That's right.
But Professor Marandi, always a pleasure to see you. I'm so glad to see you're safe, and hopefully, things evolve that we could get out of this war and return to peace in the Middle East. But it's always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. And if you ever want to ask really hardball questions about how we're slaughtering women and children day and night here in Tehran, don't worry about it.